I flew in from an important meeting at work, and when I walked into the house, I saw my own brother making love to my own wife. Then I promised myself that my revenge would be sweet. Let me tell you this story from the beginning. I always considered myself a practical man. I built my career on numbers, probabilities, and logical outcomes. My name's Tom Hunter, a mid-level executive at an energy company, and I work tirelessly to provide a comfortable life for my wife, Emily. We've been married 8 years now, solid, reliable years. Or so I thought. Last Wednesday, my boss called me into his office with news of an urgent meeting out of state, scheduled with little notice. Emily didn't seem too bothered when I told her I'd be flying out early the next morning and might not be back for a few days. That should have been my first hint that something was wrong, but I dismissed it as my mind just playing tricks on me. The next morning, I kissed her goodbye, left for the airport, and settled into the routine of business travel. As the flight took off, I thought about Emily and our life together. Our home, the vacations we'd taken, the endless plans we'd made. These thoughts ran in loops as the plane soared, my mind grounding me in the comfort of what felt like a solid, unbreakable life. But fate has a strange sense of humor. After our meeting ended, I got an unexpected message. My colleague informed me that the deal was delayed, which meant my entire reason for being there had evaporated. The next flight home was scheduled for the same evening, and I seized the opportunity, envisioning a surprise reunion with Emily. I even stopped at a bakery near the airport to buy her favorite dessert, a small token to celebrate what was supposed to be a romantic homecoming. I arrived home late, around midnight. The house was dimly lit, and everything seemed ordinary. I quietly entered, the bag of pastries still in hand, and made my way through the entryway. That's when I noticed it. Low voices murmuring from the kitchen. Emily was there, but she wasn't alone. Confused, I moved closer, careful not to make a sound. The voices grew clearer, and then I recognized the second voice. It was my brother, Sean. I could feel my pulse spike as I stood outside the door. Something about their tone didn't fit casual conversation, and I couldn't move, frozen by a sick sense of dread. I don't know how long I stood there, the room blurring around me, my grip tightening on the paper bag in my hand. I should have stormed in. I should have done something. Instead, I held my breath and listened to words that tore apart everything I thought I knew about Emily, about my brother, and about our lives. Then, as if I was caught in some twisted nightmare, I heard them move toward each other, their voices dropping to whispers. It was like I was watching a stranger's life unravel, except I was the one it was happening to. Finally, as if pulled by some invisible string, I forced myself to step back from the doorway. I dropped the pastry bag, took a deep breath, and pushed open the kitchen door. The scene froze before me like a photograph. Emily's face, contorted in shock, her body still leaning into Sean's embrace. Sean had the gall to meet my eyes with that same, unfazed stare he'd always had, as if caught in some minor indiscretion, like a teen sneaking out past curfew. But Emily, her expression was something else entirely. Horror, panic, and guilt bled across her face. I could feel a part of me snap, an untraceable fracture that sent adrenaline rushing through my veins. But I remained silent. Not a single word passed my lips as I stared at them. I was afraid of what might happen if I spoke, if I acknowledged the betrayal staring me in the face. "Tom," Emily finally stammered, pulling away from Sean and taking a step forward. "This isn't. You're not supposed to be here." "Apparently," I replied, keeping my voice calm, though my insides roared. I glanced at Sean, whose eyes darted downward. The realization hit me that he wasn't even ashamed. He was just waiting for the next move, coolly calculating. Emily's voice wavered. "Tom, I didn't mean for you to. I'm sorry, You're sorry?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. I didn't recognize my own voice. Cold, foreign, like it belonged to someone else. Emily's mouth opened and closed, like she was searching for something to say, but nothing came. Sean stayed silent, his shoulders tensed, bracing for my reaction. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until I couldn't bear it any longer. I took one last look at them, this grotesque tableau of betrayal, and walked out of the kitchen. I made my way to the front door, grabbed my keys from the hallway table, and stepped outside. The night air was sharp and cold, and I gulped it down like a drowning man. My mind was a storm of rage, confusion, and disbelief, but somehow I felt an eerie sense of calm. I just walked out on my wife and my brother, leaving them in my kitchen as if I'd stumbled on a scene from a bad movie. For a few moments, I stood by the car, just breathing, grounding myself. There was no point in shouting, in fighting. No point in doing anything in that moment. I knew I had to think, to plan, to decide exactly what I wanted to do about the two people who had ripped apart the life I'd built. One thing became crystal clear as I drove aimlessly through the quiet streets. I couldn't just walk away from this. I couldn't let them get away with it. I spent the night in a dingy motel on the outskirts of town, where the wallpaper peeled at the edges, and the sheets smelled faintly of bleach. Sleep didn't come easily. Images of Emily and Sean flooded my mind, fragments of our years together mixing with the new, searing reality of betrayal. I replayed the scene in my kitchen over and over, searching for anything I'd missed, some detail that would make sense of it. But nothing could explain away the feeling of absolute violation, the sense that my own life had been hijacked by people I trusted. By morning, I felt like a shell of myself. The anger had solidified into something cold and calculating. I knew I had to handle this smartly. Confrontation hadn't done me any good, and neither would wallowing in self-pity. No, what I needed was a plan. After a long shower, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the beige carpet, my thoughts beginning to coalesce into something sharper, more purposeful. If they wanted to treat me like a fool, they'd see what I was capable of when I chose to turn the tables. I picked up my phone and dialed the number of an old friend, Blake Winters. Blake and I went way back, almost 20 years, back to the days when life had a rougher edge and nothing was as neat and buttoned up as it was now. We both had come a long way since those days. Blake now worked as a private investigator, a good one. His specialty was digging up the dirt that people thought they'd left buried. "Tom? It's been ages, man," Blake greeted me with his usual casual warmth, though I could sense his curiosity. "Blake," I replied, keeping my voice steady, "I need your help. It's serious. Family matter." A moment's pause, then a slight edge to his tone. "I'm all ears, buddy. What's going on?" "I need information. On my wife, Emily," I said slowly, letting the words settle, "and on Sean, my brother." Blake didn't ask for details. He was sharp enough to catch on without my needing to spell it out. "Consider it done. Give me a couple of days, and I'll get back to you. Anything specific you're looking for? Whatever you can find. Phone records, meetings, where they go when I'm not around. Everything." "Understood," he replied, his voice firm. "Hang tight, and keep things normal." Normal. The idea was almost laughable. But if anyone could handle this with the right finesse, it was Blake. For the next few days, I acted as if nothing had changed. I returned home that same evening to a surprisingly quiet house. Emily greeted me with an almost cautious smile, her demeanor tentative, and I could sense her trying to gauge my mood. She had no idea how deep my knowledge ran, and the fact that she assumed I'd accepted her apology, such as it was, sickened me. But I knew I had to keep up appearances. If I let her catch on, my chance to really understand the depths of their betrayal, and what else they might be hiding, would vanish. So, I gave her just enough. I pretended to let her make it up to me. She kept the conversations light and polite, as if we were old acquaintances rather than husband and wife. It was surreal, like we were playing our parts in some twisted domestic theater. In those days, I became hyper-aware of everything. I started to notice her subtle tells, the way she'd flinch at my touch or her eyes flicking to her phone a little too often. There were times she'd laugh lightly at something, the sound tinged with a nervous edge. These things that I once might have dismissed as quirks now felt like glaring signs of guilt. 3 days later, Blake called. "You're not going to like this, Tom," he started, his voice low, almost hesitant. I gripped the phone tighter. "Go on." "It's worse than you think. They've been seeing each other for a while now. 6 months, maybe more. They're involved, deeply involved. Sean's been spending nights at your house whenever you're out of town, and Emily's even taken days off work to be with him. They have a whole routine set up." The weight of his words hit me like a punch. 6 months. How many times had I left for work, blissfully unaware that my wife and my brother were shacking up under my own roof? They're clever. I'll give them that, Blake continued. No digital trails, barely any phone communication. But here's the kicker. Sean's been talking about selling the small family cabin you inherited together. My sources tell me he's quietly been in touch with a realtor. They're listing it as a desirable remote property. That cabin, I assume, is still half yours? The thought turned my stomach. I knew exactly what that cabin meant to me. It was a place where I'd spent weekends fishing with my father, where Sean and I had bonded as kids. And now, my own brother had plans to sell it from under me, without even a word of discussion. What do they think they're going to do with the money? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Far as I can tell, they're planning to get a new place, likely somewhere out of state, once the deal closes. Sean's already in talks with a guy in Florida, Naples, I believe. They've been discreet, but there's enough to prove they've been serious. I took a deep breath, struggling to keep my composure. I want everything. Give me every shred of evidence you have. Blake promised to send over a detailed file, and we hung up. The rage that had been simmering since I walked in on them now blazed into something almost unbearable. They were planning a future together, and they'd planned it behind my back for months, making me into some clueless pawn while they set the stage for their new lives. But I wasn't clueless anymore. I spent the next few days preparing meticulously. On the surface, things were perfectly ordinary. Emily probably thought I was forgiving her, or at least trying to. I even forced myself to take her out to dinner one evening, just to keep the illusion alive. I watched her across the table, smiling as if nothing had changed. She had no idea I was 2 steps ahead of her now. After dinner, when we were back at the house, I casually asked her about Sean. It was the first time I'd brought him up since the incident. Have you heard from Sean lately? I asked, keeping my tone casual. I took a slow sip of my drink, watching her reaction carefully. She paused, her fork hovering in midair. Her face didn't betray much, but I could see her brain whirring behind those pretty eyes. Sean? Not recently, no, she said, her voice a bit too even. Why? Oh, no reason, I replied, shrugging. Just wondering how he's doing. She relaxed slightly, nodding as if she'd passed some unspoken test. I almost admired her composure. She was good, really good, but not good enough. With Blake's evidence in hand, I could see the full picture. I knew their routines, their plans, their petty, selfish ambitions. It was enough to turn any man bitter, but I'd already passed that point. My mind was clear now, crystal clear, and the solution was staring back at me with razor-sharp precision. By the time I'd finished laying out my plan, there was no room for doubt. They thought they'd outsmarted me, weaving their sordid affair into my life like some sick tapestry. They had no idea what was coming. And when it came, they wouldn't just feel my anger. They'd feel the weight of everything they tried to steal from me. As I went to bed that night, lying beside Emily's silent form, I closed my eyes, my pulse calm for the first time since I'd seen them together. They thought they were clever. They thought they could keep me in the dark. But they were about to learn what it felt like to have everything fall apart. With my plan firmly in place, I felt like a hunter, watching his prey from a distance, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Emily and Sean had already underestimated me once. They had no idea how much power they'd handed me by assuming I'd play the role of the gullible, docile husband. If they'd known what was coming, they might have reconsidered. But they didn't, and that was exactly what I was counting on. The first part of my plan involved laying out bait that neither of them would be able to resist. Sean had been edging toward financial ruin for months now. His business ventures had always been risky, and despite the fact that our parents had left him a decent inheritance, his poor decisions had drained it all. Of course, Emily didn't know this. She probably thought he was offering her a future filled with sunny beaches and freedom, not realizing she'd hitched herself to a sinking ship. I'd received the file from Blake a few days earlier. It contained copies of Sean's debt records, showing how much he'd borrowed, as well as proof of the refinancing he'd tried to secure under increasingly desperate terms. I even had information on the cabin sale, conversations with realtors, listings he'd put up quietly, emails and text messages. Every detail was there, meticulously documented. One evening, I casually mentioned the cabin while Emily and I were having dinner. I watched her face carefully as I brought it up, curious to see if she'd break. So, I've been thinking, I began, swirling the wine in my glass. How about we head up to the cabin for a weekend? It's been a while since we had some time away, and you always loved it up there. Emily froze for a split second before forcing a smile. The cabin? I don't know, Tom. Isn't it a little too rustic for us these days? Rustic? Come on, that cabin has history, I replied, my tone light but my gaze unyielding. Or have you lost interest in our little retreat? She looked away, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind, working to find a graceful exit. Maybe we can talk about it next month. I've just been so busy with everything here. But it's a nice thought, really. Her attempt at deflection confirmed what I already knew. I let it drop, letting her think she dodged a bullet. After that, I put my real plan into motion. Blake and I spent hours on the phone that night, strategizing every detail. We decided to start with Sean, the weaker link in the chain. He was desperate, arrogant, and far more likely to fall apart under pressure. He wanted money, and he was trying to get it by any means necessary. The next morning, I called him, keeping the conversation casual. "Hey, Sean," I said. "I've got some business news. Thought you might be interested." "Tom," he replied, his voice too cheerful. "Sure, what's up?" "I've been considering refinancing the cabin," I lied, casually dropping a line to reel him in. "I know it's out of the blue, but I think we could use the extra cash, especially since the market's good right now." Sean hesitated. "Refinancing, huh?" "Yeah, it'd give us both a little boost. I've already done some preliminary research, and we could make a nice profit." I paused, letting him take the bait. "You interested?" After a few beats, he answered, "Yeah, I think that could be a good idea. Why don't we meet up this week? Go over the details?" I smiled, keeping my voice steady. "Sounds perfect. How about Friday night? We can meet at your place." "Yeah, sure," he replied, sounding both eager and cautious. "See you then." As soon as I hung up, I finalized the last few pieces of my plan. Friday couldn't come soon enough. I spent the following days pretending to be the doting husband, playing my role as if nothing had changed. Emily continued with her quiet charade, and I could see she'd taken my sudden interest in the cabin as a signal of reconciliation, her eyes softening whenever I brought up memories of the place. Little did she know, those memories were the only thing she'd have left of it by the end. Friday night arrived, and I drove over to Sean's apartment, an aging complex that barely hid the financial strain he was under. I knocked on the door, and he answered quickly, looking slightly more haggard than I remembered. He offered me a beer, and we made small talk, pretending this was nothing more than two brothers catching up. After a few minutes, I took out the documents I'd brought along, pointing to the numbers and projected earnings from a sale of the cabin. As expected, his eyes widened as he looked over the figures, the dollar signs practically dancing in his pupils. "So, here's what I'm thinking," I said smoothly. "You handle the sale with the realtor, and I'll deal with the legal side. We can split the profit straight down the middle. Fair?" "Yeah, sounds great," he replied, the greed in his voice almost palpable. I leaned back, fixing him with a steady gaze. "You know, Sean, I have to admit, I was surprised you didn't bring this idea up first. I would have thought you'd jump at a chance like this." He shrugged, fidgeting slightly. "I didn't want to overstep. You know, considering it's, well, Dad's cabin." His words barely registered. All I could think about was the betrayal, the arrogance of him thinking he could just take what wasn't his. "Oh, I don't think overstepping has ever been a problem for you," I said quietly, my tone sharper than I intended. Sean's expression faltered, and he stared at me, finally realizing that something was off. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You know exactly what it means." I watched as his face went pale, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. He swallowed, his bravado gone. "Tom, I don't know what you're talking about." "Cut the act, Sean." I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "I know about you and Emily." For a moment, he just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for words. Then he laughed, a hollow, forced sound. "Come on, Tom. Don't be ridiculous. Ridiculous? I shot back, my voice cold. Is it ridiculous to want what's yours? To keep what belongs to you? He swallowed again, his expression finally cracking. Look, Tom, I'm sorry. It just happened. But it's over now. It didn't mean anything. Didn't mean anything? The sheer audacity made my blood boil. You betrayed me, Sean. You took everything that was mine. My wife, my trust, and now you want my cabin too? He had the decency to look away, shame coloring his face. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just thought. You just thought I wouldn't find out? I leaned back, letting him squirm under the weight of his own guilt. But I did. And now you're going to pay for it. Sean's voice dropped to a desperate whisper. Please, Tom. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't tell anyone. I'll walk away from Emily. I'll leave the cabin alone. You don't have to worry about me again. For a moment, I let him believe I was considering his plea. Then, I stood up, gathering the documents. It's too late for that, Sean. With that, I walked out, leaving him there, his face twisted in fear and shame. Back at home, I found Emily waiting in the living room, looking more put together than usual, as if she'd gone the extra mile tonight. She'd probably thought my meeting with Sean was a step toward fixing things. In a way, she was right, but not in the way she'd hoped. Hey, she said softly, her eyes searching mine. How did it go with Sean? Oh, it went well, I replied, my tone as measured as possible. He finally agreed to let go of something he was never meant to have. She laughed lightly, relief flooding her face. That's great, Tom. I knew you two would work things out. I looked at her, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Oh, Emily, I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. You have no idea. As I turned away, heading upstairs, I felt her watching me, completely unaware that her whole world was about to come crashing down. In the days following my confrontation with Sean, I kept myself busy with the finer details of my plan, every step a calculated move in the game they'd unwittingly entered. Emily and Sean had built their future on the shaky foundation of deceit, never suspecting that one slip would bring it all crashing down. I spent long hours at work, coming home only when necessary, maintaining an illusion of detachment and forgiveness. Emily seemed relieved by my apparent calm, the guilt and strain that had once flickered across her face beginning to disappear. She'd become comfortable again. She thought she'd escaped unscathed. What she didn't know was that I had been preparing the ultimate stage for their downfall. It wasn't enough for them to simply feel regret. They needed to understand the depths of their betrayal, to see the life they thought they'd stolen slip through their fingers in a public reckoning. The cabin sale had been halted for now, but I'd left Sean under the impression that I was reconsidering. I needed him to stay close, to keep him guessing and hoping he still had a chance to control the situation. I knew he was barely holding on to that fragile hope, but it wouldn't be long before his illusions shattered. My first step was to orchestrate a small gathering, just close family and a few friends, ostensibly to celebrate some recent successes at work. Emily thought it was a wonderful idea, even seeing it as a step toward rebuilding our relationship. She spent hours in the kitchen, preparing everything just right, oblivious to what was in store. I watched her as she arranged the food on the counter, her movements confident, her face relaxed. She'd convinced herself that she'd navigated her way back into the clear, that we were on the path to a fresh start. The irony was almost poetic. When the guests arrived, I played the gracious host, shaking hands, pouring drinks, making casual conversation. Sean showed up late, looking anxious but putting on a strained smile for the crowd. It was all I could do to keep from laughing as he awkwardly made his rounds, visibly uncomfortable in a room filled with people who believed us to be the perfect family. His eyes met mine once, and I saw the panic lurking just below the surface. When everyone was settled, I clinked my glass for attention, stepping into the center of the room. I could feel the tension thickening as everyone quieted down, waiting for what I had to say. Thank you all for being here, I began, my voice steady. Tonight, I wanted to take a moment to share a story with you all. It's a story of family, trust, and betrayal. I saw Emily's eyes widen slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face, but she quickly smoothed it over, glancing nervously at the guests. Sean shifted in his seat, his face pale, his eyes darting to the door. Many of you know Sean, my brother, I continued, my voice calm. We grew up together, shared everything, or so I thought. I allowed a pause, scanning the room as curiosity turned to tension. But recently, I discovered that some things were never meant to be shared. A few puzzled glances passed between our friends and family, some sensing the gravity of the moment. You see, I said, my voice dropping, while I was working to build a future for my family, I learned that not everyone shared that same vision. I fixed my gaze on Sean, letting him feel the weight of every word. Some people wanted to build a future at my expense, to take what wasn't theirs. Emily's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes darting toward me, then toward Sean, then back again, as if trying to piece together what was happening. The shock and panic on her face was exquisite. Sean, I said, my voice carrying across the room, why don't you tell them about your plans? Go on, tell them what you've been doing behind my back. Sean shifted, his face draining of color. He opened his mouth, but no words came out, only a strangled sound, a choked attempt at explanation. The silence stretched uncomfortably, thick with accusation and disbelief. Emily's eyes widened further, and her voice trembled. Tom, what are you saying? It's not what you think. I turned to her, my expression cold. Not what I think. Really, Emily? I took out my phone, opening the folder Blake had sent me, with photos, screenshots, and messages between her and Sean. I held it out, displaying the evidence for everyone to see. The silence in the room was absolute. Emily, I said, my voice flat, this is what I think. And Sean, this is what you did. You planned to take everything from me, from us. I let the words settle, letting each person in that room understand the full weight of what had happened. Emily's face crumbled, her hands shaking as she reached for me, her voice breaking. Tom, please. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I laughed, a low, humorless sound. Didn't mean for it to go this far? You mean you didn't expect me to find out, right? You thought you could live happily ever after with my brother, with my house, with everything I've worked for. Emily's eyes filled with tears, her gaze dropping to the floor. Sean remained frozen, staring at me, caught between shame and anger. Then, as if grasping for anything, Emily spoke up, her voice shaking. Tom, please, you can't just throw everything away like this. We can work through it. I'll do whatever it takes. I shook my head, my face a mask of calm. There's nothing left to work through, Emily. You made your choice and I'm making mine. I looked around at the people in the room, family and friends who had been there through thick and thin. They stood in stunned silence, glancing between us, shocked and speechless. I could see the pity and betrayal mirrored in their faces, their own sense of disbelief mingling with disgust. Then, I turned to Sean, who had finally found his voice. Tom, come on, he muttered, barely above a whisper. You're taking this too far. We can work this out. Work this out. I repeated, my voice ice. Sean, you betrayed your own family. There's nothing left to say. He opened his mouth to argue, but I raised my hand, stopping him cold. I think it's time you left. The weight of those words hung in the air, an undeniable finality in them. Sean stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but he had nothing to say. He turned on his heel and walked out, his steps echoing in the silence. Emily remained, still trying to salvage whatever was left. She looked at me, pleading, desperate. Please, Tom, don't do this. Don't just end it like this. I held her gaze, my voice steady. Emily, it was over the moment you decided to betray me. With that, I turned and left the room, leaving her standing there, alone, the weight of her choices finally crashing down around her. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I drove out of town, letting the open road clear my mind and calm the storm that had raged for months. The finality of what I'd done was slowly setting in, bringing a strange mix of relief and emptiness. The life I'd built with Emily, the brother I'd trusted, all of it was behind me now, severed with a few simple words and one brutal confrontation. I stayed in a quiet lodge near the lake, miles from the home that now felt more like a crime scene than a sanctuary. The silence of the night filled the empty spaces left behind by my anger and hurt, and by the time dawn broke, I felt something that I hadn't expected: peace. In the following days, I took care of practicalities, detaching myself from the life Emily and I had shared with methodical precision. I started with the house, moving every trace of our shared memories into storage and calling a lawyer to discuss the terms of our divorce. Fortunately, I'd been careful enough over the years to keep my assets secure, meaning that Emily wouldn't be walking away with much. The house was in my name, and I intended to keep it that way. When I returned home, the place was empty. Emily had gathered her things, leaving behind only the artifacts that held no value to her, small tokens and mementos of a life she no longer cared for. The silence in the house was a balm, and as I walked through each room, I felt a strange sense of liberation. This place, for all its memories and betrayals, was still mine, and I'd remake it into something new, something untouched by the poison they'd brought into it. My first night back, I poured myself a drink, sitting alone in the dim light of the living room, watching the shadows cast by the furniture. It was strange, this newfound solitude, but also freeing. No more secrets, no more lies. Just a blank slate, waiting to be filled with whatever I chose. A few days later, I received a call from Blake, who'd been keeping tabs on Sean as part of the final phase of my plan. "Tom, you'll want to hear this," he said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "Sean's hit rock bottom. He tried to sell his car, but no one's biting. And the cabin sale, well, that's off the table now that you've reclaimed your share. He's scrambling to find work out of state, but with his reputation, well, let's just say his options are limited." I allowed myself a small smile, letting the words settle. Sean's dreams of starting fresh had collapsed, and he was now left with nothing but the consequences of his own betrayal. He'd gambled with everything he had, and lost. "And Emily?" I asked, though my voice lacked the bitterness it once had. "Last I checked, she's staying with a friend in the city, trying to lay low. Not many people willing to take her in, given what happened," Blake replied. "Looks like word of the affair spread faster than she'd anticipated. Can't say she's adjusting too well." I felt a strange, detached satisfaction at the news. I hadn't sought vengeance for the sake of pain. I'd sought justice, a chance to reclaim my life and my dignity. And now, with both Emily and Sean facing the consequences of their actions, I could finally put the past behind me. "Thanks, Blake," I said, feeling a sense of closure settle over me. "I owe you one." "Anytime, Tom. Take care of yourself." With that, I hung up, feeling a new chapter open before me. Over the next few weeks, I poured myself into rebuilding. I repainted the house, rearranged the furniture, and made plans for a small garden in the backyard, a project I'd always wanted to start but had never had the time for. It was therapeutic, watching the transformation unfold, erasing the traces of a life that had never been what I thought it was. Surprisingly, some friends and family who'd witnessed the confrontation reached out to offer their support. People I hadn't seen in years stopped by, offering words of encouragement, sharing their own stories of betrayal and resilience. Each visit reminded me that I wasn't alone, that there was a life waiting beyond the ashes of what I'd lost. One evening, a friend named Linda invited me out for a quiet dinner at a small Italian place. We talked about everything but the events of the past month, losing ourselves in casual conversation and laughter. It felt good to be around someone who expected nothing of me, who offered simple companionship without the weight of expectations. At the end of the evening, as we said goodbye, she paused, looking at me with a quiet understanding in her eyes. "You know, Tom, sometimes losing something is just the beginning of finding something better." Her words stayed with me as I drove home, echoing in the quiet of the night. And for the first time, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she was right. Months passed, and the changes I'd made to my life became more than just surface-level adjustments. They were a declaration of a new start, a commitment to living life on my own terms. The house felt different now, each room filled with purpose, each day free from the shadows of the past. One evening, as I was finishing up work in the backyard, I caught a glimpse of the setting sun casting a warm glow over the freshly planted garden. The sight stirred something in me, a sense of contentment I hadn't felt in years. This was my life now, simple and quiet, but mine, and that was enough. A few days later, I received a letter from Emily. She'd written to apologize, her words filled with regret and remorse, detailing how she'd misjudged everything, how she wished she could take it all back. She'd asked for a chance to talk, to explain, to make amends. I read her words with a sense of finality, recognizing the emptiness in them. There was nothing left for us to say, no explanations that could undo what had been done. I folded the letter, placing it in a drawer without a second thought. Some things, I knew, were better left in the past. As I closed the drawer, I felt a weight lift, a sense of peace settling over me. This was the end, not of what I'd lost, but of what I'd found in its place. I glanced out at the garden one last time, the colors soft in the evening light, a symbol of the life I'd rebuilt from the ruins. I'd faced betrayal, confronted the depths of my own anger, and emerged on the other side, stronger and wiser. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. The future lay open before me, unmarked by the scars of the past, filled with the promise of a life I could finally call my own. And as I sat in the quiet of that evening, I knew one thing for certain. I was ready to move forward, to embrace whatever came next, unafraid and unbroken. Subscribe to the channel and like this story if you liked it. Turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. Click on the playlist on the right to listen to previous stories. See you soon.